Check, 1, 2.
One, two, three.
Welcome to Pièce de Résistance, a show about the geopolitical stakes of a world in turmoil. From London, I'm your host, Stan Vojevodsky. On January 3rd, I predicted on this show that 2026 would be the most consequential year in global affairs in many decades. And as we close on this first month, this prediction still stands. Today, I want to welcome to the geopolitical bunker a 40-year veteran of international diplomacy, someone who has worked in the resolution and mediation of conflicts and application of international justice. Jean-Daniel Ruch, welcome to the show. You're an ambassador, former of the Swiss Republic in multiple countries. I should name them: Serbia, Montenegro, Israel, and more recently, Türkiye. You were a Middle East, a special envoy for the Middle East peace process, and you were also the founder and former president of the Geneva Center for Neutrality. I started by saying this was the most consequential year in global affairs in many decades. You have many decades of experience. Would you concur with this assessment in your many years in the international diplomacy?
Well, Stan, thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a real honor and a real pleasure. Now, I would answer your question as Zhou Enlai, the iconic Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mao Zedong, replied to André Malraux, the famous writer and Minister of Culture of Charles de Gaulle, when Malraux was visiting him in China. And when Malraux asked Zhou Enlai, what do you think about the French Revolution? He said, well, it's too early to tell. And it was almost 200 years later. And I think it's really too early to tell whether what 2026 will bring us. But I think there are two ways to look at it. I think one of the major disruptions in the way the international system has been working is the factor Trump, who is sort of breaking all the codes of international relations and international diplomacy. Now, if you look over the longer term, we don't know whether this Trump episode will just be a parenthesis in the world history, and after that we'll go back to the normal, which is not super effective either in terms of international management, but still, or whether this disruption or whatever will be established during these years of disruption will become the new normal. And frankly, this is too early to say what is going to happen in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. We live in changing times, in times of a very, very high uncertainty. I think everybody realizes that. And in these circumstances, I think we have to try to navigate with the wind as much as we can, especially as small states like mine.
Thank you. You speak of 200 years since the French Revolution, so I'm going to go back 207 years. In 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Switzerland, your country, decided that it would inscribe almost in its constitution the doctrine of perpetual neutrality in the conduct of its foreign policy. And no country more so than Switzerland has distinguished itself over the course of the last decades in mediating and being an honest broker in a number of resolutions and mediations of very complex global issues. Can you tell us a little bit about what neutrality means for Switzerland, and whether today, in this environment where all countries, middle powers, as well as smaller nations, are almost forced to choose a side, choose a camp, is neutrality still relevant today? Is it still possible to be neutral in these times of changes?
Well, before answering your question, I would like to to point at something which is a bit curious, and many people don't know about that. It is that Swiss neutrality was recognized by the big powers of the time in 1815, but it was very much a Russian interest and invention, Russian. And this has some relevance today. The Russians had this idea, together with the other powers, that it was important to separate revolutionary France from the monarchies, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, further away Russia, by a buffer zone, un cordon sanitaire of small neutral state to separate the German powers from the French. And this is why Switzerland, together with a number of other states, including south of Switzerland, everybody has forgotten, but somewhere between Torino or the French Geneva and the Mediterranean Sea, you had a kingdom called Piedmont-Sardaigne, which was also a neutral power. And why is it relevant? Because sometimes I have the feeling that this is a bit the way the Russians imagined the European security system after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the failure of trying to create a new security system for Europe, which would have been based in the Russian mind in the OSCE. And they thought, okay, so the best way is to create a buffer zone of states between us and NATO. And the buffer zone is Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and then in the Caucasus, the three Caucasus states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So the Swiss neutrality as it was conceived in 1815, I think has a lot with the thinking of some of the great powers still today, especially Russia. That's why I think, to answer your second question, yes, neutrality has a relevance, I think, in two ways. On the one way, you have certain states who are sort of torn apart because they are between the blocks, and their societies are torn apart. Think of Moldova. I mean, everybody was on the western side of Europe. Everybody was so thrilled that Maya Sandu won the election, that she won her referendum pro-Europe. But if you look at the figures, you will see a society which is deeply divided. And this is a society, Moldova, a country which has neutrality in its constitution. So I believe neutrality for countries which are really geographically located at the border between two blocks may find an interest in neutrality. But this is not the most important aspect. The most important aspect, in my view, is that in this dramatic competition for power, for territories, for spheres of influence, and for resources, I think it's very important that you have a critical mass of middle powers, smaller states, who can try to bring back the real issues, the real important issues for the survival of mankind on the international agenda. I mean, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has been publishing since the beginning of the nuclear age, a kind of doomsday clock, I think that's the way they call it, doomsday clock, has just a few days ago put the clock as close to midnight, which means the extinction of mankind, as it has been since 1945.
I think it's at
there
86,
are issues.
86 seconds.
Yeah, exactly, 86 seconds. Now, what are the real risks for the survival of humanity, and what are the collective interests of the whole of humanity? It's about climate change, it's about inequalities, injustice, and it's about nuclear weapons. I would name those three issues as the most important for the survival of mankind. And the great powers, because they are in their great power games, they are too blind to approach effectively those issues which are at the core of the survival and of the well-being of our small world. In Davos, there were many things in Davos, and most people recall the performance of Donald Trump. But in my view, this was not the most important speech. The most important speech was the one made by the Prime Minister of Canada, who called for medium states to sort of create a network, come to the reason and try to reason the big powers into thinking collectively for the collective well-being of the world instead of their own selfish interests. So yes, there is a very important role. And there is also an awareness, among many leaders, thanks God. We have heard Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada. But I see that also in the civil society. To give you a small example, last June, we were asked to organize, in the framework of the Geneva Center for Neutrality that I co-founded, a seminar with institutions interested in the concept of neutrality. And to our great surprise, we had over 90 participants. We had no budget, no nothing. We didn't pay people to come, nothing. This was really there. If you are interested, you participate. So we had 90 participants from 27 countries, from all continents. And I think this shows that there is a real awareness raising within civil societies from Latin America all the way to Asia, Africa, and Europe, that we cannot rely on the on a governance system for the world which is based on the relationship between America, Russia, and China.
That's fair. Now, I want to go back to some of your experiences as a diplomat. And since we're on the topic of Russia and obviously the conflict of Ukraine is occupying so much of the international attention, political capital, and bandwidth. In your last post as ambassador in Türkiye in 2022, there was an attempt at a resolution of the current conflict. And it is understood from public information that has circulated since that the belligerent parties were almost on the cusp of a resolution that addressed neutrality, as you spoke so eloquently, of Ukraine in between, this Western and Russian sort of those two worlds that have taken Ukraine as a sort of a battleground. It is understood also that Switzerland was perhaps called on to play a role as an honest broker or in helping by way of its neutral doctrine to help implement or facilitate this resolution. Do you think an opportunity was missed? And can you speak to that particular sort of moment in time? And could we have avoided with perhaps a lot more political will from all sides the 2 million casualties that the war currently has suffered, and perhaps some of the very painful concessions that are being asked Ukraine to abdicate in order to resolve this conflict today?
Oh yes, absolutely. When it became clear in March of 2022, so like 2 weeks after the Russian invasion, that you can actually describe in legal terms as an aggression. I believe it's a fair point to say that it was an aggression, legally speaking. So just 2 weeks after, there was a first meeting between the belligerents at ministerial level under Turkish mediation in Antalya, in the context of the Antalya Mediation Forum that Turkey is organizing every year. And then the talks continued in Istanbul. At that moment, our foreign minister, Ignazio Cassis, called the Turkish foreign minister and said, well, what can I do? Can we offer any sort of assistance? And neutrality was indeed one of the hot topics. Not the only one. An even hotter topic was a territorial question about the future sovereignty over the Donbass and over Crimea. But on this particular aspect of neutrality, which was a Russian demand, The Ukrainians, the Turks, were very happy to have our advice. So I was called to meet the top negotiators. That was late March, early April of 2022. And he told me, and this was confirmed to me then by the lead negotiator of Ukraine, they had a text, that the text probably could be approved by both Putin and Zelensky. Actually, later I heard that it had been approved by Putin. So a ceasefire was possible. And they wanted to have one part of the text about neutrality, and the Turks were thinking that the participation of Switzerland in this negotiation process would grant legitimacy to the concept of neutrality for Ukraine, and maybe would make it more easily acceptable to Ukraine, because Switzerland has profited tremendously from its neutrality. I think that if today we are a rich nation, it is because, not only, but also because our neutral status, so it would have granted some legitimacy to a neutrality of Ukraine. But also what the negotiators, Turkish negotiators told me this day was, Jean-Daniel, everything is possible, is on the table, it can be agreed, we are very close to a deal, but I'm not optimistic. And if I'm not optimistic, it is because I see that some great powers have no interest in finishing this war now. They see it through the lens of a global agenda, and for them it's premature to end this war. This was what he said in substance. And indeed, a few days later, Boris Johnson was in Kiev, and we know that after that the talks collapsed. I think what Boris Johnson said to the Ukrainian is, we are not going to provide security guarantees. And a few days later, the Defense Secretary of the United States, Lloyd Austin, he said, no, it's too early. We have to weaken Russia. The point is to weaken Russia. And here we are, 4 years later. What? You say 2 million dead. I don't think that anybody has a precise calculation. Maybe it's 2 million. Even if it's 10,000, it's way too much, way too many. We have to think of the victims of this unnecessary war that could have been halted right at the beginning. But this is where we are, and these are these kind of great power games I'm talking about, where you would need a critical, strong force to be able to talk to this guy and to pressure these guys to say stop.
There has been a strong movement led by President Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but also Ursula von der Leyen and Chancellor Merz, to come together as a coalition of the willing and help Ukraine change the tide and allow Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength. What, in your opinion, is really the genesis of this conflict? Is it not, and please correct me if my view and analysis is skewed, but is it not at the very heart a global power competition and a proxy conflict between the United States and Russia? And if it is it not for those two powers to resolve this? Is it really a conflict that at the heart involves the European countries?
Certainly the European countries could have helped to put a halt to this conflict earlier if they had played differently with their support. In that case, they have just, this coalition of the willing was mostly about providing the means to the Ukraine government to continue this useless war. Now, the question, which is not an easy one to answer, is could the Europeans have done something different? For instance, going to Moscow and try to find an arrangement with Putin so that there would be a ceasefire and then some peace agreement, and sort of say, okay, if you don't agree to this ceasefire, then we'll continue to provide weapons and play with the money they have. Potentially, they could have done that. However, from my experience, from the 90s, when we were trying in the OSCE in Vienna to imagine this new architecture, this new security architecture of Europe, from my experience, the only thing the Russians are interested in is America. They want to be considered as an equal partner by America. And the reason why Trump managed to make some progress, I mean, because I think there is serious progress after Anchorage, but now these days in Abu Dhabi, all the noises I received from Abu Dhabi, even though we don't know the details, but what we see is that there is a very serious negotiation taking place. And what you needed is for an American president to talk to the Russian president, to Putin, and to give the impression, to show to Putin that he considers him as a business partner, actually. And I think this is the way Trump is dealing with Putin, as a business partner. Russia, I mean, we can talk about the origins of the crisis. Not sure how far you have to go in the history, and also maybe it's too early to try to understand the real causes of the crisis. I mean, you remember that it took us 100 years to understand precisely the mechanics that led to the First World War, thanks to the master work of Christopher Clark called the Sleepwalkers. And I think we are not there yet. We don't know yet all the communication, everything that happened between Russia and the West in the years that led to the aggression or to the invasion of February 2022. My gut feeling and my subjective feelings, not just subjective, is based on the things I read and I know, but also from what I know from the Russians, is that they had the fear that they were getting surrounded by American interests, that the Americans might deploy in their immediate surrounding offensive and defensive weapon systems, including anti-ballistic missile systems. And we can talk more about that. I think that's a very important issue. There was a treaty prohibiting anti-ballistic missile, the ABM Treaty of 1972, and America under George W. Bush left unilaterally that treaty. And this treaty was the cornerstone of a world based on mutual assured destruction. No, meaning that I know that if I shoot a missile at you, I will receive 10 missiles in return and I can do nothing, so we will all both destroy. Therefore, I will never use nuclear weapons for the first time. But now, if you have anti-ballistic missile, this destabilizes the whole system because we're never sure which missile will go through and maybe it can be stopped on the way. So the Russians started to fear these American ambitions back then. And then they were, I think, concerned that they might deploy such systems, such anti-ballistic missile system in Ukraine. Furthermore, the attempts of America to penetrate in the Caucasus and in Central Asia also increased this feeling from Russia that they were getting surrounded, and that the ultimate objective of the Americans was not just the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, but of the Russian Federation. And I think these kind of fears, it's not just revanchism. Of course, they were humiliated and so on. But I think it's more than just revanchism for what they lost in the 90s. I think it has also to do with I think, legitimate concerns of today. And what is missing in all this, what has been missing in the rules-based order, as the Americans like to say, because they don't like to talk about international law, what has been missing, in my view, is a genuine effort to try to go back to serious arms control agreement between Russia, I think China should be included as well, and America to create a sort of new strategic stability after the dismantlement of the arms control regime that existed during the Cold War. During the Cold War, don't forget that the regime was put in place during the Cold War. So I think if you want to talk about Ukraine, we have to have all this big picture also in mind.
Agreed. You talk of President Bush not reconducting the ABM treaty. We're a few days away from the START treaty to come to expire. It is my understanding that Russia has asked the United States for its position. Do you think the lack of response as of today from the U.S. government, as it's also trying to negotiate a resolution which seems to favor Russian interests in at least the kind of demands that they have expressed to Zelensky to agree to. Do you think that's part of a strategic ambiguity play on the part of the U.S. administration, and that they eventually, assuming that the Ukraine resolution gets to a positive outcome, will eventually recommit to the START treaty?
I think you gave the answer. I do think so. First, we have to go back to the Anchorage summit last summer. I think that was the beginning of a process which may now lead to a happy conclusion. And the first happy conclusion is a cessation of hostilities, call that peace or ceasefire, whatever, but stopping the fights in Ukraine. And my sense is that now it has become a genuine, more than a possibility, almost a probability. Then I think that in Anchorage they also talk about the broader issues, including strategic stability. And it's very interesting that in the national security strategy of the United States, the new one, that was released, made public
end of November,
late November, early December, Russia is being framed in terms of we have to look for a new strategic stability with Russia. Mm-hmm. In previous doctrines or strategies, Russia was a competitor, the rival, the enemy, the threat, whatever you call it. Now they talk about strategic stability, and strategic stability means, in my view, nuclear arms control. So maybe there is a give and take taking place now between the Russians and the Americans, and the give and take is you agree on cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, and then we work on strategic stability. We agree to your proposal of a moratorium on the deployment of new nuclear arms, meaning keeping in place the ceilings which have been established by the New START treaty, which is still in force for a few days. And then there is an array of possibilities, because the Americans would like to cooperate with the Russians on many other issues, including, of course, energy, including mining, including prospection in the Arctic space, which is opening us because of the melting of ice. So there is a whole range of possibilities which would open up if the Ukraine crisis would be solved one way or another.
In recent hours, President Trump has asked President Putin to cease and desist, at least for a period of a few days, bombing Kiev and other cities, so that the diplomacy and the negotiations can unfold unhindered and give some respite and some appeasement as they try to work out the details of what this resolution might look like. And it seems that President Putin has acquiesced to President Trump's request to give way to the proper conditions for this resolution. Yet, President Putin has insisted for a meeting to happen at the request of President Zelensky, but that this meeting should happen in Moscow. And President Zelensky responded today, Friday, that it's out of the question and that President Putin should come to Kiev. Do you think both of these parties, under the tutelage and leadership of the United States, should meet at the Geneva Center for Neutrality and give back Switzerland its true essence and role at the center of the game?
Well, of course, maybe not at our center. I think I don't think we have the logistics to accommodate the visit of two of the most powerful persons in the world. But definitely, Geneva or Switzerland could do that. The summit that took place between Biden and Putin took place in Geneva. Actually, I sat on the seat of both of them, Putin and Biden, which are in a beautiful place in Geneva, in the old city.
Was that 2021?
So absolutely, that would be the natural, traditional role of Switzerland to host such a summit, because it's obvious that this is a game. I mean, Putin saying Zelensky come to Moscow, will never go to Moscow. I would not. Who would go that? And then, of course, the tit for tat is, come to Kiev, and of course he will not go to Kiev. We all know that. So, in my view, Geneva would be the right place to go. There is, in Switzerland, and I know that, the Swiss government would be very keen to do whatever it can to host such a meeting. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The problem is on the Russian side. The Russians have decided that we are an unfriendly country and we have lost our neutrality because we took over the sanctions, the EU sanctions, not all of them, but most of them, against Russia. And then there is another issue which should be dealt with the International Criminal Court. Putin being indicted by the International Criminal Court, legally speaking, Switzerland would have an obligation to detain him and send him to The Hague if he would come to Switzerland. Now, there are ways around that, and I think Switzerland has been working with the ICC to find legal ways to overcome that latter difficulty. But the first one is the real problem. I mean, Russia doesn't like us these days, and I think they are wrong, because I believe that Switzerland genuinely would love to be able to contribute to a peace treaty. Now maybe they will go to Istanbul, maybe Abu Dhabi, or I don't know. But in my view, Geneva would be the right place, and maybe Trump should join them as well, because I know now Trump has a very, very bad image in Europe, really bad image, and for understandable, legitimate, and right reasons, Minneapolis and other things. But in that particular case, he has been a mediator, maybe a successful mediator, one still a bit too early to tell, but the odds are rather positive, I would say, in those days. So maybe at the end of the day, they will all meet in the Rose Garden of the White House.
You speak of...
like Rabin and Arafat did
in 94.
When was that?
The Oslo Accords.
Years ago. Yeah.
Yes. You speak of the International Criminal Court and indictment of President Putin. You were yourself a political advisor to Carla del Ponte, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Where do you see international justice courts? And before you answer a forward-looking vision of the relevance of these tribunals for the conduct of, justice in the future, do you see it as an easy element of a negotiated outcome for whatever indictment President Putin is currently prosecuted under the International Criminal Court to be lifted to expedite a sort of broad resolution of this conflict?
Well, I would be surprised if Putin would travel in the near future in a country which is a member of the International Criminal Court. Let's not forget that the International Criminal Court is not a UN institution. It has a limited number of members, and neither Russia, nor the US, nor China, nor
Our signatory.
Israel, Turkey. So the great powers do not want to have an international justice system above their head. This is mostly an institution comprised of medium small states, Europeans, Africans, Latin Americans, very few Asians. And when we talked before about the necessity to have a kind of coalition of neutral states, actually it overlaps pretty well with the membership of the International Criminal Court. And that would be the duty of those states to recall the importance of international law. And international justice is the only, or the ICC is the only accountability or enforcement, real enforcement mechanism for international law. Because in the cases of violations of international law, the international body who should be responsible for remedying these violations or for correcting them or for enforcing international law is the Security Council. As we know, the Security Council has been ineffective, but international criminal justice, the ICC, can play an important role in terms of enforcement and accountability for international law, in particular international humanitarian law, violation of the Geneva Conventions, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and also the crime of aggression. So I do believe that the ICC has an important role to play if we want to have a world, or go back, or move one day to a world which is ruled by the law and not by the force. Today, we are moving in the totally opposite direction, but the speech of the Prime Minister of Canada, plus everything else we are doing here, gives me some hope that not in 2 years, not in 3 years, but over the longer term, we may create a critical mass of states who will say, no, the world has to go out of this chaos and has to be based again on certain standards, on certain rules, and these rules are called international law. But nowadays, we are not there. Nowadays, everything is in crisis. International law is in crisis. The UN is in crisis. The ICC is in a very difficult situation. 12 magistrates of the ICC, including judges and prosecutors, are under very harsh American sanctions. They are not allowed to use dollars. They are not allowed to travel in the US, neither their families. And basically, they cannot operate any banking transaction which would go through the United States. So these financial sanctions are pretty harsh. Will we manage one day to overcome this? Well, you know, the world is moving, and maybe one day it will again move back to the right direction. But it's important for small and medium states, those who are funding the ICC today. It's mostly Europe and Africa. It's of paramount importance that Europe and Africa stand firm in support of international justice. And the other part of your question was, what about Putin? Now, I do believe that if it's about making peace, signing a peace treaty, putting an end to the more than a bloodshed, a butchery in Ukraine, there are ways around that can be arranged to grant immunity to Mr. Putin for maybe a period of time or so, to travel to a country which is recognizes the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court, and therefore, in principle, is obliged to arrest him. There is one more thing I would like to say. I'm slightly disappointed about the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, because so far Putin has been indicted, or any Russian, there are only 2 Russians who have been indicted. Putin and I think the woman who is the representative for human rights. And they have been indicted for abduction of children. Now, every crime must be punished, and there is no question about that. But when you see the size of the disaster, the size of the destruction, the number of victims, you would have thought that the investigations of the International Criminal Court would have looked into very serious crime scenes with murders, because you have many more victims. And this has not been done so far. Nobody was indicted for Bucha, for instance. Nobody was indicted for serious war crimes which were committed during the course of this war, except for the abduction of children. So, I do believe that for the credibility of the International Criminal Court, it would be very important that they continue and maybe that they accelerate the investigations into these other crime scenes. And there again, I'm not saying that the Russians are the only ones who committed war crimes. I mean, we have indications also that on the Ukrainian side, war crimes happen, that, for instance, civilian neighborhoods were bombed or were attacked by drones. All these are war crimes that need full investigation. And so far, this investigation has produced only this indictment for adoption of children, which is a bit frustrating for people like me who are really trying to give credit and to support international justice.
Okay. I want to talk a bit about the Middle East, which is not usually a region that I cover, but as you're a former special envoy for the Middle East peace process and have held embassy in that part of the world, I want to ask you what you think of this Board of Peace. And before you give me your candid and honest opinion, is this Board of Peace filling a vacuum that the UN system, since we are talking that the multilateral system of global governance is under attack, is it not in part due to perhaps the failure of the UN system and the UN Security Council to resolve durably conflicts and tensions around the world, which, President Trump and all his, I think, very unique, some will say narcissistic way of handling resolutions seems to have been more efficient. And case in point, the release of all the Gaza hostages and some sort of a modus vivendi between Gaza by mobilizing regional partners and creating this ad hoc sort of board of directors for which he will be chairman for life. What is your take on the Board of Peace, and how does that reflect on really the failures of the multilateral UN system and the UN Security Council's constant gridlock and inefficiencies?
I think it's very unfair to blame the United Nations for the failure of finding peace between Israelis and Palestinians or in the broader region. The United Nations Security Council is as good as its member states, and I should even be more precise, as its permanent member states. I'm pretty sure that if Trump had proposed everything he's proposing with the Board of Peace and the Executive Council, and then also the Palestinian governance system, within the framework of a UN resolution and of the UN Security Council, nobody would have objected to that. Everybody would have saluted that. By the way, the Board of Peace was officially enshrined in a Security Council resolution, so its sort of existence was legitimized by a Security Council resolution last year. Not because Trump attached any sort of importance to such a resolution or to the UN, but because some of the states who were approached, because he made a broad consultation before moving forward with this, with his scheme to enact a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And the states around the states he consulted, many Arab and Muslim states, including Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Emirates, and many others, they all told him, I believe, or many of them told him, this has to be enshrined in a Security Council resolution. Also because this would give the legal basis for many of them to get involved. And don't forget that as part of Trump's peace plan, there is the idea of deploying a force, a military force, to watch over the ceasefire and also to disarm Hamas. Good luck, by the way, with that. So for many states, you need a very strong international legal basis to deploy troops, especially in such a sensitive area and especially in such a volatile place, because it remains volatile despite everything. So I think it's wrong to blame the United Nations Security Council.
Blame its members.
But what we have seen in the Middle East, I think since the 50s or maybe 60s, since Suez, maybe since the Suez crisis in 1956, is that the Americans have wanted to keep the monopoly on each and on all peace efforts in the region. They want to be the mediator in the Middle East. It's also because this is what the donor class in the United States, and as we know, very serious donors in the United States are closely connected to Israel. This is what the donor class want. They don't want anybody else. They don't want the UN to play a role. They want America, because they trust America and they trust Israel, especially this government, relies almost only on the support of America. If America would tomorrow stop supporting financially or militarily Israel, I mean, that would be dramatic for that state, and it would be that's maybe the main existential threat to Israel, is if one day America doesn't want to support financially and militarily the Israel. That would be really be dramatic and tragic for the future of Israel, probably. So America wanted and has managed to keep a monopoly on each and every mediation there. Now, what has made a difference since the Biden years or the Trump one or Obama years is that Trump, despite, again, all the prejudices you might have about him, he came to power with this notion, I won the Nobel Peace Prize, I can solve every conflict in the world. And he really pushed hard. And he's the only American president since George H. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, who has really pushed and exerted real pressure on Netanyahu to eventually accept this very much unsatisfactory ceasefire, which is not really a ceasefire, because as my friend Daniel Levy told us the other day, Daniel Levy, who was a negotiator on the Israeli side in Oslo and later on also, who is now a commentator, and he told us the other day, well, it seems that when the Americans are mediating a ceasefire in the Middle East, the ceasefire is worth only for the enemies of Israel. So the Hezbollah has to keep the ceasefire, Hamas has to keep the ceasefire, but the Israelis are not really bound to the ceasefire, and we know that since the ceasefire was agreed upon, about 500 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces. So that's quite a ceasefire. But still, the way Trump envisions peace, which seems megalomaniac, hard to believe, unlikely to happen, but still, his vision of peace is not what this government in Israel had in mind.
Okay.
This government in Israel, pushed by its most radical elements, had in mind the deportation of the whole population of Gaza and maybe later of the West Bank. I mean, what's going on in the West Bank, nobody talks about that, but there is more settler violence, Israeli settlers violence in the West Bank now, with evictions and so on. Then ever since there is an occupation since 1967. So the plan of the Israelis was certainly not to find a nice deal, and the priority was not the release of hostages, because Biden had a deal on the table, had put a deal on the table in May 2024, and the same deal almost was put on the table and forced through the throat of Netanyahu by Trump at the beginning of 2025, immediately after he came to power. So Trump actually, he has a willingness. I mean, whatever the situation is in Gaza on the ground today, is certainly better than what it was before there was the ceasefire, even though the ceasefire is not being kept. And then we have this vision. Now, what gives me a little bit of confidence in the fact that maybe it's not just an empty vision and maybe things will move progressively, is that within this board of peace, there are some serious partners. Turkey is one of them. The fact that Turkey is there is, in my view, a guarantee that it's maybe not just paper, but something may happen. Egypt is there, Qatar is there, the Emirates are there, Israel, of course. So all the main players are there. But the challenges are enormous. And you can be sure that as long as Netanyahu is in power, he will use each and every crack in this agreement or in the implementation of the agreement to push for resumption of the fights. Because he's himself domestically under very, very serious pressure. Elections will take place this year. He may lose them. He may end up in jail. And he may come to the conclusion that for him the best way to stay in power is to show his force and to be a war president. And I'm not sure that this ceasefire is really serving his needs.
Jean-Daniel, however, I want us to wrap up on the more optimistic note that you brought forth, that there are, in spite of it all, on this Board of Peace, some credible members that can be relied upon to have a fair implementation for the sake of peace in the region. I want to thank you again for this masterclass in diplomacy and your understanding of global affairs as they've come to unfold in recent months. I hope you'll accept to join again on our show, Pièce de Résistance, to continue explaining to our audience really the fundamentals of the turmoil that we're going through today. Is there anywhere that viewers can maybe look at your analysis? I know that you have a podcast. Would you like to maybe promote it and give the information to our viewers?
Oh, well, that's very nice. I didn't know I could do some marketing.
Sure, absolutely.
So we have a weekly podcast with my friend David Laufer, who is also a Swiss citizen, who is a journalist and a writer based in Serbia, in Belgrade in Serbia.
Can you give us the website address or the YouTube account?
So it's on YouTube. You have to look for Ruch, R-U-C-H, Ruch. And Laufer, L-A-U-F-E-R, Ruch and Laufer. And you will see our... among the highlights, we had Shlomo Sanz, very famous Israeli historian.
Yeah, Jeffrey Sachs last week. That was a very popular show with over 200,000 views.
Jeffrey Sachs was there recently, and we are now in contact with also very exciting people to talk on our show.
All right, Ambassador Jean-Daniel, thank you so much for your time today and for helping us better understand what the heck is going on. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you very much.
We hope to see you very soon. Thank you.